Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Great to see you all here with us tonight. We have another wonderful presentation in store for us. I can also tell you that the two previous presentations in this season are already up on our website. So if you missed one of those, you can go to our website and find it there. So as most of you know by now, my name is Dan Snydacker, and I'm co-chair of the Education Committee at the Touro Synagogue Foundation. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the third session of this season of the Judah Touro program series. I want to thank everyone who's made this series possible, including Merrill Cawley, our site director at the synagogue and at the foundation, Ann Arnold, Emily Grigori, who's our Zoom administrator tonight, and the other members of the Adult Education Committee, Shirley Sanders, Sam Shamoon, Donna Padrat, and Emily Colbert-Cairn, who's on the faculty of Salve Regina University. I also tonight want to take a minute to thank several of our sister synagogues and organizations for their help in getting the word out about this season's programs. We've really had a great response from people all up and down the East Coast. First of all, Salve, the Newport Art Museum, the American Jewish Museum, the Simona de Nepi from the Museum of Fine Arts, folks in Charleston, Kurt Justas in New Orleans. There's a group in Recife, Brazil, in Curacao, in Montreal. There's a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in Montreal. The folks in Jamaica have been very interested and participated. The Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia has been very helpful, as has the Center for American Jewish History. The Columbia Department of Art History, the RISD Museum staff, there you'll see them in the next program at the end of March, and the Brown Art History and Judaica programs. All these folks and others have helped us spread the word about these wonderful programs. And thanks to all of them for helping attract people to this series of diverse programs that seeks to connect the history of Touro Synagogue to important themes in American history, to develop a more relevant and sophisticated voice for that history, and bring it to as wide and inclusive an audience as possible. Those are our goals for the program. Tonight, we're returning to Amsterdam. We were there last time, but tonight we're returning for another program to help us understand the Jews who first came to Newport and established Touro Synagogue by looking at the work of a number of distinguished artists who pictured the Jews of the 17th century there in their work. Amsterdam had become, at that point, an epicenter for a new version of Western Sephardic, Spanish and Portuguese Jewish culture, architecture, and religious practice, all of which strongly influenced Newport's first Jewish settlers, who arrived here in the late 17th and early 18th century. So remember those dates. We began this season last December with a presentation by Dr. Paul Finkelman that addressed one of the most compelling and difficult issues in the history of Touro, and in fact, the entire Atlantic world, and that was Jews, slavery, and the meaning of freedom. Then just last month, we featured a remarkable examination of the architecture and meaning of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, or the Esnoga, presented by Dr. Peter Verdingerbroek, who's a distinguished architectural historian in Amsterdam. And then jumping ahead to March 30th, the last session in this season's programs, we will close with a collaborative presentation hosted by the Rhode Island School of Design Museum and their ongoing program titled Local Collections in Conversations. It will feature Touro Synagogue's Ner Tamid, our eternal light, and the great chandelier, which just stands just back from the hekel, from the ark, along with comparable objects from the collection of the RISD Museum. The staff at the RISD Museum are choosing those objects. So it should be a wonderful kind of coming together of objects. Presenters will include Howard Newman, our own Howard Newman, a nationally respected Newport artist and conservator who restored both these objects and many others in the synagogue in a recent restoration, and who's also very involved with Newport Haverah. So all of these programs that I've just kind of reviewed with you are posted on the Foundation's website, where they can be viewed in full at any time. You can view part of them and come back to them. Now, let me introduce you to our speaker for tonight, Dr. Samantha Baskind. Samantha Baskind is a distinguished professor of art history at Cleveland State University and is the author of 5 books, including The Warsaw Ghetto and American Art and Culture, Jewish Artists and the Bible in 20th Century America, Jewish Art, A Modern History, and an Encyclopedia of Jewish American Artists, and Raphael Sawyer and the Search for Modern Jewish Art. That's a productive career right there. But she has also published over 100 articles and reviews on broadly ranging topics, from 18th century prints of Dutch Jews to portrayals of Jews in film and television, to 20th century Jewish American artists' biblical imagery. Her work has been funded by, among other sources, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, and 2 year-long fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities. That's top shelf stuff. That shows that she is broadly and highly respected. Professor Baskind serves as editor, too, for the U.S. Art for the 22-volume revised edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica, and is currently series editor of Dimyanat, Jews and the Cultural Imagination, published by Penn State University Press. Dr. Baskind's presentation tonight will illustrate the background and the context of Newport Jews as they forged a new identity for themselves in a new culture in the English Empire, but worked to keep connections with the traditions and practices of the Western Sephardic world in Amsterdam and emanating from there. So it then gives me great pleasure to give you Dr. Samantha Baskind. Samantha.
I'm just getting ready to share my screen. Do you see it?
Yes.
Great. All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm very glad to be here. I teach about your synagogue to my class. I teach a survey class, an art history survey class. It's Renaissance to the present. And I teach Toro Synagogue. I think it's, we teach so many churches and pietas and crucifixions, and I find it very important to bring Judaism into that. And so I do. I'm talking today about Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews in 17th and 18th century Amsterdam. Most of you have probably heard of the first artist that I'm going to talk about, Rembrandt. And Rembrandt, he's my favorite artist. I'm just going to lay it out there. I'm a modernist. I teach 20th century art. That's my primary of specialty, with 18th century being my secondary area. But this Rembrandt is the best. I'm going to debunk some of the sort of mythology around him. So we'll start with that, and then we're going to look at some later artists, and many of them are influenced by Rembrandt. So Rembrandt has been credited with being a great lover of the Jews. He, brings the Jew out of stereotypes. But I want to think about that. He does great things for Jews and really interesting when it comes to Jewish art. But there's one of the major 17th century Dutch scholars. His name is Simon Schama. And Schama said a long time ago, and I'm quoting him, Michelangelo's Moses has horns on his head, but Rembrandt's does not. With this minor act of iconographical surgery, the image of the Jew was translated from the realm of monsters to the realm of men. In Dutch art, unlike any Christian art before it, the Jew is readmitted to the company of humanity.
Wow.
So Rembrandt indeed has pictured the Jews in a way that they had not been pictured before. And I'm taking you to 17th century Amsterdam, the golden age, like this tremendous flowering of the arts in Holland at this time. We have Rembrandt and Jan Steen and I'm trying to think who you might, and Jan Vermeer, major, tremendous artists. But what Rembrandt does is he moves onto the Jodenbraestraat. As a young man, as a young artist, he lives on the Jodenbraestraat, which is the Jewish Broad Street. So it's always been said, oh, he moved there because he loved the Jews. He actually lived there because artists lived there too. So this street is populated with Jews. Again, it's the 17th century. We have Sephardic Jews, mostly Ashkenazi Jews come a little bit later. But Sephardic Jews, Holland and Amsterdam are very tolerant. The Sephardic Jews are dignified and wealthy, and they're merchants, and they're assimilated, and they're accepted. They really have a lot of privileges they didn't have elsewhere. And so it's a place to live that feels safe. And because they weren't loud and unruly with the ways that they practiced their Judaism, that made them also acceptable. That changes a little bit when the Ashkenazi Jews come, because the Ashkenazi Jews, when they come more into the 18th century, they're less dignified. And I say that, it's complicated, but they're not as well dressed. They're not as well assimilated. They look different. Sephardic Jews, as we'll see in a number of these works of art that we're going to be looking at, look like the general Dutch population. So here we have Michelangelo's Moses with horns, and Rembrandt's Moses with the tablets of the law. It's from 1659. And in this work, so the Hebrew's pretty good. It's not perfect. He's got 2 tablets here, and his interest in the Jewish face, and that's a loaded phrase right there, but Jewish physiognomy, like he saw the Jews as really interesting, and he wanted to show Jewish people as the true people of the Hebrew Bible, which is what we see here. And that idea that Jews had horns was just a misinterpretation of the language in the Hebrew Bible. He really had like rays of light shining from him. And actually, if we think about it, having horns, it has the bad connotation that Jews have horns because they're otherly and they're bad, but bulls are strong animals, right? Horns connote some sort of strength. So I think that's another way to look at it. But here we have Rembrandt this is an imposing painting. It's just quite so beautiful. It's very Rembrandt. And this figure, this Moses, is based on images that figures and people and Jews that Rembrandt would have seen on the Jodenbraestraat. So when he's making images of the Hebrew Bible, again, he uses those faces that he's seen. He makes tronies, meaning small paintings, portraits, like studies of Jewish faces. This is David playing the harp before Saul. We have a lot of images from the Hebrew Bible from Rembrandt. We also have a lot of images from the Christian Bible with Jews used for Jesus's face. Here we have 2 of those studies, portrait of a young Jew and bust of a young Jew. These are Ashkenazi Jews. We know that. They're wearing their skull caps, their kippot, but based on the trim of their beards and the way that their hair is styled. And they're not modernized for the time, as we're going to see what that means in a moment. So here we have these 2 Jews in these studies. Keep them in mind as we start to look at some other works. And I'm bringing this particular painting in because it's pretty intriguing. Here we have Belshazzar's Feast. It's from 1635. So this is in Rembrandt's kind of early period. The subject is from the Hebrew Bible. So look at the upper right corner. Oops, wasn't ready to do that. Look at this upper right corner. Can you see my cursor? So, yeah. Great, thank you. So this is a stunning image. It describes an episode from the book of Daniel, and we have Hebrew lettering up there in Aramaic that expounds an unpublished theory of a very well-known rabbi and publisher and scholar of the time, Manasseh ben Israel, who we will talk about momentarily. So through Israel, Rembrandt comes into direct contact with Jewish interpretations of the Bible. They lived near each other. And there are two images that indicate a relationship between the men, this being one of them. So I don't know if some of you are trying to decipher what this says up here, if you know Hebrew. But the story, let me tell you about the story in the Hebrew Bible first. It tells how King Belshazzar of Babylon sinned against God. So Belshazzar commanded servants to bring the golden and silver vessels that his father Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the temple in Jerusalem. So this brazen sacrilege could not go unpunished. And so during the feast in his palace, a mysterious, and that's what you're looking at, heavenly hand wrote a cryptic message, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And here it is. Look, it's written like this, up and down, Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And there's the hand. So it's an odd form of Hebrew script. And that script right there was indigenous to Rabbi Israel's teachings. So the characters aren't arranged horizontally, as we can see. So it's this magic square that Manasseh ben Israel had been working on, but it wasn't published yet. So if it's not published yet, then Rembrandt had to have heard it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So it was not in the public yet, is what I'm trying to tell you. So that's one indication of Rembrandt's relationship with the Jews in Holland, specifically Israel. Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel was Sephardic. And we're now looking at two prints. The one on the left is a Rembrandt. It's portrait of an unidentified man. This is important. I'll get there in a minute. Formerly Manasseh ben Israel. And then there's one on the right, Salam Italia's portrait of Manasseh ben Israel. It's from 1642. So they're kind of close in time. We no longer consider the image on the right, on the left, to be Manasseh ben Israel. If you look at the two, Italia, who was a Sephardic Jewish artist, we know for sure that's Israel. So it's labeled as such. So that helps us realize, wait a second, we've misidentified the earlier print. And it's clearly a dignified Jewish figure, very assimilated Sephardic Jew. So that's the current thinking about that particular work. And Italia is a whole interesting story unto himself, but we don't have time for that today. This is an identified portrait of a Jew. This is Dr. Ephraim Bueno. The print was actually, the work on the right is the actual final version. The painting on the left is like a sketch for the print. So, and it's beautiful. It gives a sense of like Rembrandt's working process and his color palette. His palette is just, it's always like these incredibly, these browns. You can sort of see he paints with a very heavy impasto right here, like his thick paint and the way that he lays down in like almost a sketchy fashion in the painting. So this is definitely a portrait commissioned. So of a Jew versus those tronies I showed earlier. Those were just studies that Rembrandt made for his own purposes. And Jan Lievens, who Rembrandt they had the same master and they were competitors. This is Ephraim Bueno as well in this particular print. We can get a better sense of what he looks like here too. So the other instance where we can connect Rembrandt with Manasseh ben Israel is this particular project. So this is the Glorious Stone, or Nebuchadnezzar's statue. And this is a series of prints that he made, these etchings, to illustrate a treatise that Israel was writing. So showing you this to establish the connection. We don't have time to go too much into depth. They ultimately weren't really used because if you notice here, we have an image of God in Daniel's vision, one of the etched plates. And you can't have Jews. Wow, there's a lot of falsehoods around the ideas of Jews and the arts and making art. In other words, the second commandment, when interpreted strictly, says, you shall not make any graven images. So that has been misinterpreted. Jews don't make art. It's been a canard that's tarred Jews over time. Jews aren't creative. Jews do not make art. That's not the case. Jews make art. Why don't Jews have maybe as long a artistic tradition as Christians do? My students ask me that. And I tell them, well, if, the Jews always on the run, living in the diaspora, moving from place to place, it's not like they're going to tuck their canvases underneath their arms and run from country to country or city to city for their lives. So that's why we don't have as long a tradition. Who knows what was made? But also, Jews didn't have access at different times to the kind of learning environments. They couldn't go to certain academies or schools to learn how to be artists. So in fact, Jews have a long tradition of art, and I teach it. But in this case, we do not show God, right? When God is shown in artworks, God is shown as the hand of God. So just to look at one more really interesting Rembrandt that also indicates a relationship with Israel. This is Jacob blessing the sons of Joseph. It's from 1656. We can see that same beautiful palette that he uses. So here, we've got Jacob with his long beard and his soulful eyes. When Joseph hears that his father Jacob is dying, if you're not familiar with this story, he takes his sons Manasseh and Ephraim to see him because he wants Jacob to bless his sons. And the blind old man is willing to do so, but to Joseph's surprise, he puts his right hand on Ephraim's head. So the reason the reason this is interesting is that Rembrandt includes in this beautiful painting not just faces that might have been inspired by the Jews in his community, both Ashkenazi and Sephardic, but he includes a sort of a midrashic idea. Perhaps Manasseh ben Israel explained this to him, but the woman on the right is Jacob's Egyptian wife. So let's move on to some works that from the Christian Bible. Rembrandt made this head of Christ based on some Sephardic or Ashkenazi Jews in his community. In this case, we're looking at an Ashkenazi Jew. It's a really beautiful work. And this one too. What's interesting is that, well, this is a shame, Rembrandt went bankrupt, but we have this sort of tremendous inventory of his works when he did go bankrupt. And in that inventory, it indicates that these two heads of Christ were in his collection. So here we go. And here's another. And what Rembrandt has done, we have these more sort of these portrayals of Jesus, not like as having more Semitic features. He's often shown as the very elongated face, Jesus, that is, and like lighter skin and lighter hair, but based on Rembrandt's relationship with, picturing the Jews of the period, he has a different interpretation. And then Dürer, a German artist, this is an early 1500 work in which Jesus, right here, is not shown in any way like those images of Jesus I just showed you. And in fact, the Jews were typically shown in art as the killers of Jesus, as hook-nosed monsters, really negative, horrible perceptions with lots of stereotypes. And that's what Sciamma's talking about. That's what sort of instigated Sciamma's comment about Michelangelo's Moses has horns, but Rembrandt's does not, and bringing the Jew to some level of humanity. Now, like a head of Jesus, like the one on the left, it's a copy after a lost painting by Jan van Eyck. It's from 1500. You can see that different kind of Jewish face. Campan's Christ and the Virgin on the right. Again, not like Rembrandt has depicted Jesus to this point. And even in this work, this Incredulity of Thomas from 1634, Rembrandt is not completely influenced by his environment yet. We have that sort of not Jewish look. Again, that's a problematic term, but we're dealing with, a certain community in Amsterdam. We know Jews look very different in many different places. But then, as time wears on, and Rembrandt is living in his community. We can see here a very different kind of Jesus influenced by this kind of study on the right. And here, for this supper, he's got challah in his hand. So just to sort of take this one step further, and this is taking us, this just to be clear that Rembrandt does this, he makes Jesus Jewish, and it becomes something that is repeated throughout art history continually. Morrissey Gottlieb, a Polish Jewish artist. Here we have Christ preaching, Jesus preaching with, and you can see his features, his hair, and that tallis around him. Or Max Liebermann, another European artist from the 19th century, the 12-year-old Jesus in the temple with scholars. Again, we have a tallis right here. And Liebermann was Jewish. He's an interesting figure. He goes to Holland. This is Jewish Street in Amsterdam. We've jumped to the 20th century briefly. And here, by this time, Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews have merged, right? There's no like this clear differentiation between the two. And this is mostly just a Jewish community, a Jewish ghetto, a very busy street of peddlers. As opposed to, as we go back to Rembrandt, I just want to mention again that we have this mythology around him, that he was a great lover of the Jews, and he wasn't not a lover. What he was a man who had an incredible ability to of psychological penetration. Like he was an attentive and tireless sort of observer of humanity, and he reinvigorated the Hebrew Bible in art. And he painted many portraits. This was believed for a small period of time to be a portrait of Spinoza. Scholars, decades ago had the tendency to associate too many of Rembrandt's works with Judaism, with Jewishness. This is not Spinoza. The age wouldn't be right in 1665. So I just want to point that out. Another example, this is Jews in the synagogue. Are these Ashkenazi Jews? Are these Sephardic Jews? What synagogue is this? This is no recognizable synagogue in Amsterdam. Oh, and then one scholar, and the prevailing interpretation of this for a period of time was, this is a minyan. But it's I'm not entirely sure there are 10 people here, unless you count this little head as a 10th. And this sort of costume, these clothes, seem more to place this particular print as an imaginary print, as something different, as this sort of pretend kind of imaginary medieval structure. So a product of Rembrandt's imagination is what I'm saying. So to come back to the original sort of, beginning, this sort of thesis, just of Michelangelo's Moses has horns and Rembrandt's does not, takes us even further to what happens to the Jews in art over time. We've jumped to the 19th century. Briefly, Yosef Israels, the heir to the tradition of Rembrandt. Israels is Jewish. And I just wanted to show you this painting. It is so beautiful. It's a son of the ancient race. It's from 1889. And he loved Rembrandt. He painted in the same kind of palette as Rembrandt. Here we have a poor Jewish peddler, this exhausted man, painted, with heavily applied paint and just a sense of humanity, a son of the ancient race. So Israels is a Jewish, successor to Rembrandt. And he, as I said, he loved Rembrandt. I mean, we can look here at Portrait of an Old Man. Look at the gesture, look at the faces, like some similarities here. I'm not saying Portrait of an Old Man is a portrait of a Jew. I'm just showing it sort of as comparative material. And Israel's too, he painted many works. We have a Jewish wedding. We have Ashkenazi Jews here. We're going to start looking way more at Sephardic Jews in a minute. Many of you might know Rembrandt's The Jewish Bride. It's arguably his best known work. It's just gorgeous. I love it. It's in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And there's always a huge crowd around it. I can never get close enough. And in this case, we don't know that these are Jewish figures. We don't know that this is a bride. This could be Rebecca, this could be Isaac, this could be Jacob. We don't know. This could be two Jewish lovers or a couple from the Hebrew Bible, but we don't know. So just to, as we move out of the 17th century, I want to mention that Jewish landmarks were painted a lot. This is a Jacob von Ruysdael. It's the Jewish cemetery. It's dated in 1654 or 55. It is the Sephardic cemetery right outside of Amsterdam. And it's, you know, these are actual real sarcophagi, but there's also it's a product of his imagination at the same time. So in other words, there was not a church, like there's no identifiable landmarks around it. There was not this imaginary church in the original geography. And this painting in the end is an allegory of life, right? It's like a memento mori. You know, we all will die is the idea of a memento mori. But then there's hope, right? There's regeneration. And then this is just a small detail, two small details. He signs it right here at the bottom. And right, you know, art history is about looking really closely. We have some Sephardic figures right here. Can you see those at the center? These mourners right at the center in black, smartly dressed. Which brings us to the 18th century and Bernard Picart, who I've written about extensively. He illustrated, in great part with prints, a very long, involved 7-volume book in 1723 was the beginning of the volumes. So the works we're going to look at are from 1723. 7 volumes. The first volume was The Catholics and the Jews. It was supposed to be a scientific study of all the religions and customs and people of the world. And so Bernard Picart and Jean Bernard did this together. Bernard, the text was culled from lots of sources. Picart made all these images, mostly not from life. He did get to meet some Jews. He was a Protestant sort of refugee in Holland. He's from France. Picart was a Frenchman. And he made these 18 images of Jews for this 7-volume work. It was supposed to be objective, right? We're going to objectively show all the religions and people of the world in a comparative manner. It's a beautiful volumes. They're 18.5 inches tall. They're really big. In this work, so this is The Search for the Leaven. It's a really interesting print because you see a woman standing at the center of the scene. She's placing crumbs on her dining room table. And to her left, children were watching her in earnest. And we have one's holding a candle. This is, traditional to illuminate the man scraping the crumbs on the other side of the print. So if you just looked at this, what would you think is going on? Right? Like The Search for the Leaven, it seems like folly. And in Holland, there's lots of fun paintings like by Jan Steen and non-Jewish artists, during this earlier period with Rembrandt, that could be this kind of scene, like The Search for the Leaven. Why is a wealthy family, these are wealthy figures dressed well in a nice home, searching for leaven? But in context, it starts to make sense. All these images are usually labeled, as you can see here. And so it's not folly. We're witness to a sacred right of the Jewish people, which is familiar to me and probably many people in the audience right now, but not to the general public. So the woman, and this is key, she's dressed as any bourgeois 18th century Dutch woman would be, but she's Jewish, and they're preparing their home for Passover. They're symbolically removing the chametz from the home before the first night of the holiday. And that's commanded to us in Exodus 12:15. So it's one of these 23 etchings that accompany this 18th century opus on the religious rituals. And some of you might have seen this at some point. This is a very famous print. It's a print he made for the volume, and it's the first volume again, is the Jews and the Catholics. The dedication of the synagogue of the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam from 1723. And I mean, we really get this beautiful view of the synagogue and its grandeur and all the people that are crowded into it. So it's supposed to be documentary. And we can again see these Dutch Jews look fully assimilated, they're wealthy. They look like any other Dutch person might look. And I'm bringing this up for a reason. We're going to get there. But first, I just always have to show, this is sort of the signature image when you're talking about Jews and synagogues in the 17th century. This is an Emmanuel de Vita interior of the Portuguese synagogue from 1680. It's a beautiful painting. And we have here, oh, and there's the chandeliers Dan was talking about that are being explored for Toro Synagogue in the next talk, but we can also see some, tremendous chandeliers here too. Non-Jews would come to the synagogue and they would look around and see what are the Jews doing? And the Sephardic Jews knew they were being watched, which also they would wanted to comport themselves because they knew they were being watched and their position was still precarious. There's tolerance in Holland, but the situation is still always precarious for the Jews. So we can see these, the beautiful high ceilings and the light that streams in this painting, which again is very well known. But, I always get asked, why did de Vita make a painting of a synagogue? Well, he was an architectural painter. In Holland during the 17th century, artists had specialties. And in this case, his specialty was just architecture. He mostly made churches. This is an interior of the old church in Delft. And less well discussed is the fact that de Vita made 3 paintings of the interior of the Portuguese synagogue. So the famous one you just saw, then this one, which is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and then one that's lost. It was most likely destroyed during the Second World War. So here's another one where we can see the chandeliers even more, and we can see these other, well-to-do figures watching the worship. And the light is not so good. Like this is a little bit of a dark image. I can't get a better one. So this is my picture that I took of it in the Israel Museum to get a sense that it is a little more light infused. And it's actually not a good photograph, but it's the best I can offer you. And I just wanted you to see. So this is, again, way less known than the first one I showed you, but it's important. And then, of course, I always like to show the actual synagogue in Portugal, the actual Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, which is beautiful. Those are the chandeliers. We get a sense of the architecture. We get a sense of this is where the Sephardic Jews worshipped. And it is a place that you can go visit anytime you're in Amsterdam. It's open to the public. And there's, many painters over time painted this or etched or drew the synagogue. This is a French Sephardic Jew, Jacques-Emile Edouard Brandon. It's Silent Prayer, Synagogue of Amsterdam, the Amidah. And it's from 1897. It's a 19th century French academic painting, but it's showing the synagogue in Amsterdam. And I'm interested too, and we're going to get back to humans and people again, but all of these sites, these Jewish sites in Amsterdam are intriguing, and we have paintings that are lesser known. Like we know the de Vita, but this is Gerrit Berkeda's view of the Sephardic and Ashkenazic synagogues from the 17th century. And you can see how vastly different they are in scale and in beauty. The Sephardic Jews had money. The Ashkenazi Jews did not have money. And again, this is the Sephardic synagogue. And within the etchings, so I'm back to Picart. In his suite of etchings, there's 20, as I said, there's 23 etchings of the Jews, but the Ashkenazi Jews dominate the community by this time. By the mid-18th century, there are 13,000 Jews total in Amsterdam, and 10,000 are Ashkenazi. So 10,000 Ashkenazi, 3,000 Sephardic, but the Ashkenazi Jews barely appear in any of his etchings. Why is that? I think because there was how should I put this? Picart's imagery probably functions like as a critique of this second type of Jew that arrives in Amsterdam. In other words, we have finally a differentiation. We have Sephardic Jews, we have Ashkenazi Jews. Picart identifies them down here. Down here at the bottom, the Day of Atonement as celebrated by German Jews. So he identifies them as German Jews. We only have 3 that show German Jews, and look how different they look in their synagogue. I think that he only shows German Jews a few times because he wants to minimize that sort of sense of difference between the 2 types of Jews. German Jews made the regular, the non-Jewish population of Amsterdam uncomfortable. They were loud. They would march down the street during their holidays. The Sephardic Jews kept their worship confined, right? It was behind closed walls. And look, so we can see the clothing is different, and they're wearing, sackcloth. And so here we have, specifically here are the German Jews, as opposed to, say, an image of the Portuguese Jews. So this is actually a nuptial ceremony, so the wedding ceremony of the Portuguese Jews. It takes place inside. Look at the beautiful canopy, the beautiful chuppah. Look at how well they're dressed. It's a somewhat quiet ceremony. We have the bride right here, sitting here, quietly veiled. So this is what a Portuguese Jewish ceremony would look like in Amsterdam. And this is a German Jewish one. This is the nuptial ceremony of the German Jews from 1723. So that's a really interesting comparison. The German Jews in Amsterdam are getting married outside. They have a talus on their head as their chuppah. They've got figures that are just hanging out on the roof. This is more of a raucous party than the quiet that we see here, and that this is not out for the public to see, but anybody could see this. So the comparison tells us something about, what Portuguese ceremonies look like, what German, Ashkenazi ceremonies look like. Another really interesting print from the suite of prints is the circumcision of the Portuguese Jews. This obviously is taking place indoors. We can see their clothing. We can get a sense of who they are. But it's kind of funny because here's the baby, and the baby's peeing. So the baby, it's a silly kind of like moment. These are everyday people, right? They have the same sort of issues and problems and moments. This happens to be a circumcision. And we don't have time to talk about it, but in this sort of scientific bent that these volumes were supposed to convey, there's labels for all the figures. So the father of the baby is A, and so on. So we have, labels C, D, and sometimes they're hidden. It's easier to see in the bigger volume. Picart's not the only artist to chronicle Jews, to have this scientific impulse to understand more about Jewish life and practice in Amsterdam at this time. This is another circumcision scene. This is from the 1683. It was in a different kind of scientific book to understand the Jewish people in Holland. But I want to return to Picart. So just like Rembrandt has been elevated as a great lover of the Jews, but we have, some visual evidence and some historical evidence that indicates that it's more nuanced than that. We also have Picart, who is, said to show the Jews with so much fairness, and he knew some Jews. He was invited to a Passover Seder. But I want to throw a little wrench in that too, just briefly. This is the frontispiece for the entire volume, entire series, so all of them. And this frontispiece is showing all of the religions, and isn't quite all of the religions, but look. So this is the Jew right here. We have Islam right here. Then we have some like ancient, as he puts it, like ancient, like Asian religions. This is the church, Catholicism, and Christianity right here. And you can see it's heavily labeled at the bottom. So what's going on here? When I was sort of drawn into the idea that Picart, really cared about the Jews and he was showing them as fairly as possible, but this frontispiece indicates something else. This is the first thing that readers are going to see when they open up this book. So I want to go to a detail. So when I pointed out the Jew kind of at center, here he is. And then here's Christianity, and that's the Roman Church. And look at the Jew with his scroll as opposed to the book. And we have this figure stomping, stepping on, physically accosting the Jew. So this falls into an unfortunate trope of the book versus the scroll, right? So we have the book versus the scroll. The scroll is ancient. The scroll here is on the ground. And for those Jews in the audience, if the Torah and synagogue falls on the ground, we're commanded to fast for 40 days. But the bigger idea here in art, and it would be understandable to someone versed in art from this time, is that there's the new Israel versus the old Israel, right? So meaning like the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And it's sort of understood as like synagogue versus ecclesia. And it's what Picart is basically produced here is a supersessionist idea that, again, that the old Israel has been superseded by the new Israel. And the Catholicism right here, up here, this large figure, right? This, holds a sacrament in the olive branch. She's the Roman Church. She towers above all. Again, that idea of synagogue versus ecclesia, I just want to mention one more, say a little more about, but here we have, synagogue is blinded to the true faith, which is the church. I could show you, this is just a detail of an altarpiece from the late 15th century. I could show you so many of these. It doesn't stop. This is from the Strasbourg Cathedral. The sculptures have actually come off the facade of the cathedral. But this is, again, we can see that idea with blinded synagogue and then ecclesia who has seen the light. To return to Picart, who, again, he's more interested in the Sephardic Jews, but here we have an Ashkenazi Jew right here. And so that when a new pope is, being paraded through Rome, he's sort of in this, throne-like carriage. And here we have a Jew, presenting the Pentateuch to the Pope. And this is a problematic image. We have the Jews here in the back, and this kind of old figure, this stooped figure, not a Sephardic Jew. This is from Picart's imagination, this work. This is not based on, him seeing this particular moment. And we have this stooped Jew, as if this is the old, right? Literally an allegorical old man handing over the old book to the new book. I always hate to end on a negative note. So I want to just bring up, our beautiful painting of the interior of the Portuguese synagogue, of the Sephardic Jews of Amsterdam and Holland, this just tremendous space, and end with just showing something positive and just affirming before I'm very glad to take, as many questions as you would like. This is Picart's dedication of the synagogue of the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam, one more time. And I open it up to questions. Thank you very much.
Samantha, that was just fabulous, and just to seize on one thing, dates overlap so closely with the arrival of Jews in Newport. The first evidence we have of Jews coming to Newport is 1658. It's not strong evidence. They were in New York in 1654, so the chances are good that they were here during that period. they buy and commission and bless the cemetery in 1677. The Jews who were doing this, the Jews who were arriving in Newport, who were creating the cemetery, were exactly the Jews that Rembrandt and Picart were picturing. We don't have any contemporary American images of these Jews that do this in Newport. So what you've shown us tonight is the best evidence we have, the best surviving evidence of what the Jews in Newport looked like, what they looked like in synagogue. They were largely Sephardic Jews, and that continued up through the construction and dedication of the synagogue. Later on in the 18th and especially in the late 19th century, that same shift happened here. It happened in Amsterdam. The Sephardic community was reduced, and the Ashkenazi community took over, dominated. Was just a great presentation. A comment from Arlene Nicholas. Thank you. Fantastic information and images. So we're getting great feedback.
Great.
But the wonderful image that you had of the Western Sephardic Cemetery in Amsterdam, Peter Blairninger showed an image of that.
Oh.
A contemporary picture of that. So that tied in nicely. The chandeliers that you illustrated give us just great ammunition for talking about our chandeliers when we talk with RISD. Obviously, those chandeliers were meant to both to illuminate the inside of the synagogue, but also to connect Turo to the synagogue in Amsterdam. There's a visual connection that's established there. It's just amazing. And one of the other wonderful things about all of this is that you're talking about prints and books. And in 1748, the Redwood Library gets established. And so Newport becomes a town, a small colonial community where some of these books are available for folks to see. So it connects Turo to the broader community here as well.
Well, the Sephardic Jews at this time in Holland, they didn't commission so much. They bought art. Art was very affordable at this particular moment. And they bought art. They didn't commission a lot of portraits, which is interesting. They didn't have so much portraiture, but they commissioned books and Haggadahs and Megillahs. They wanted to have those beautiful objects. So they had art and they had money so they could buy art. So, and they wanted illustrated books, and they paid for books, and they had beautiful books.
Yes, absolutely. Another question has just come in. Again, thank you for a fascinating lecture. Have you or are you publishing a book on this subject?
Well, I have written 3 articles about Bernard Picart. So I'm done with him for the most part. I was really interested in that dichotomy between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, and why Jews are finally given their own identities. The fact that there's the notice, wait, we have Sephardic Jews, we have Ashkenazi Jews. So I wrote about that, and I have written, about other prints like of circumcisions and other sort of books over time that show the Jews in this sort of scientific way. And Rembrandt is my true love. I adore him. Years and years ago, when did I wrote my master's thesis in 1996 on Rembrandt and the Jews. So a very long time ago. Now I mostly write about 19th and 20th century American art, Jewish American artists.
Another question came through. You stressed the differences in the representation of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews by artists and linked that, at least in part, to the differences in social interaction with this is a good question, with the larger Amsterdam community. Were these differences reflected in the interactions between the Sephardic and Ashkenazic communities themselves?
So there was a conflict between the communities. So the Sephardic Jews wanted to help their Ashkenazi co-religionists, but at the same time, they were embarrassed by them. And the Sephardic Jews didn't want to be looked down as more lowly or to be kicked out because the Ashkenazi Jews were ostentatious and they were poor. They would beg for money. Ashkenazi Jews would beg for money from the Sephardic Jews. So over time, the relationship deteriorated because the Sephardic Jews had had enough, right? So when they first come to Amsterdam, they're very supportive. They're trying to help them get on their feet. But they're, in the Sephardic Jewish mind, like they're too religious and they're too old fashioned and they don't look Dutch. They don't dress Dutch. So that relationship fractured for a period of time. And then the differences sort of started to melt away, as the next century, as we move into the 19th century and the Jewish communities blend more.
Yeah.
And they disperse and they come to America or wherever they went.
Right. By the way, I want to remind folks that there's a wonderful small exhibit at the RISD Museum, our collaborator in the next program, called Past Made Present. Samantha, I think I sent you an image that I had taken of that includes portraits not of Jews, but of Africans and African Dutch people. So if you want to see some, if you're eager now to see some Rembrandts in person, go to the RISD Museum, and that's a really wonderful, powerful small exhibit there. So I urge you to do that. Any other questions? I think we've done that, had most of our questions. Just a wonderful, wonderful presentation. We really thank you so much, all of us. Thank you so much for doing this for us. And we hope to keep you involved. We hope to, have you come here. We hope to be able to, at some point, present some hybrid presentations where our speakers are actually in the synagogue, and yet we also gain the benefit of a Zoom presentation. So watch out. We may come back and ask you to come to Newport.
You would not have to ask twice. I would be so thrilled to be in your synagogue speaking to your group.
Yeah, great. And speaking of visiting synagogues, remember last time Peter Vertigerbrook made the same kind of invitation to come for anybody here to go to Amsterdam and give him a call, and he would show us the synagogue. So let's get some transatlantic travel here. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Samantha. Thanks to everyone who's helped make this possible. And we look forward to seeing everyone again on March 30th for a further examination. Again, your lecture really sets up our study of that chandelier. And we're still getting information about the main chandelier. If anyone knows anything, we just had a similar invitation from Mikveh Israel Emmanuel, that they would welcome us to come as well too. So that's a wonderful benefit of this series. So anybody have any information about our great synagogue, our great chandelier? That would be wonderful to find that out. We'll include it in our discussion with RISD, but we'll also put it in the 360 virtual tour that we've been working on. We've now got 26 points of interest to populate that 360 tour, and one of the points of interest involves the chandeliers. We'd love to have that kind of crowdsourced. Anything you've got on that chandelier would be welcome. So with that, I'm going to bid everyone good night. Have a really wonderful weekend.
Fabulous.
Good Shabbat, and we will see you again on March 30th.
Thanks a lot, Dan, for inviting me.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good night.